Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I want to tear down the barriers to opportunity for people right across the country, including young people. Because with 2.8 million people out of the workforce due to long-term sickness, that's bad for them and their living standards, it's bad for employers who are desperate to recruit, and it's bad for the economy as a whole. In order to get Britain growing again, we've got to get Britain working again, and that means a big new change to employment support.
That was Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, with the pitch. The government wants to get people back into work, but at what cost? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Welcome to the programme. So, Caroline, Labour wants to increase the employment rate. They're aiming to get it up to 80% from just shy of 75% right now. But the way they're planning to do it is giving me a bit of deja vu. This Get Britain Working white paper promises to help lower the country's benefits bill. £137 billion is where it stands at the moment. And that was Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary. Measures to be announced by her include the removal of welfare payments from people who refuse education or training. Sounds a little get on your bike to me. But Keir Starmer's government could face a bit of a backlash for this from its own MPs on ideological grounds. You could say the crackdown on benefits is, as I say, reminiscent of the austerity policies that Labour had spent so much of its time in opposition regaling.
Well, aside from their own MPs and also the rather strange appearance of the word worklessness, which I think is a bit old-fashioned in some ways, the government's also likely to face some pushback surely from businesses over job creation, because the emphasis is on them to deliver some of this, especially after the government hiked taxes for employers in the autumn budget. And yesterday, the CBI conference, the big business lobby annual event, they had a survey out that really was employers showing their annoyance and frustration around the budget. Are the two aims then that Labour has incongruent? Looking at the numbers, you've got 700,000 more working age adults who are economically inactive now than before the pandemic.
Yeah, let's discuss now with Bloomberg's Ailbhe Rea and dig into the politics of it all. Ailbhe, you've been writing about this problem now for Labour, but before for the Tories. As Caroline says, it's something that's been ongoing since the pandemic. I wonder what this Get Britain Working white paper says about the government's diagnosis of the economic inactivity problem.
As you say, this is a white paper, which means that it's sort of in government language. That's when the government releases a report that details in quite extensive detail what the problem is and sets out the government's policy to solve it. At time of recording, it hasn't been published yet. It comes out in about an hour's time when Liz Kendall gets up to speak. We've had a very detailed press release and, background conversations, but I think, it is completely possible that there's some detail in it when it's published in an hour or two that we haven't seen yet. But we kind of already know the problem, like the two of you outlined it. We're looking at 2.8 million people out of work due to long-term sickness. That's an all-time record in the UK, but also 9.3 million working age adults economically inactive. So, as you say, the government has set this target of an 80% employment rate, which is a level that the UK has never had. It was at its peak, I think it was around 76% just before the pandemic, but we've never had an 80% employment rate. It's lower than that now, but as part of this push for growth, the government is really keen to tackle this problem. And then, of course, there's obviously the extra offshoot problem of that, which is the big benefits bill, which keeps rising.
And very few countries, OECD countries, have anywhere near that 80% level either in context. In terms of whether it can bring down the benefits bill, because that's the other equation, whether this will actually mean cuts to welfare, we also don't really know about that at the moment.
Yeah, you could say that the government is kind of taking a carrot and stick approach to this, and today is the carrot and the stick is coming in the spring. So this is the kind of the white paper that sets out the kind of positive things that the government thinks it can do to encourage people back into work. We've kind of highlighted, reading between the lines, some of the trickier things that you mentioned, Lizzy, such as withdrawing benefits from people who don't accept work or training. But actually, the real thrust of it from the government is sort of positive incentives. So every young person to be offered employment or training, changing job centres so that they're not so focused just on delivering benefits, but sort of the skills agenda, making sure that people are in the right kind of training for employment and looking at the overall career trajectory of things. That this paper is also looking into how employers can better support people with long-term sickness or disabilities to stay in the workforce. It's all meant to be quite positive, and it's more the sort of the journalist spin of like looking, between the lines, that means that it's still looking a bit. People are sort of trying to work out where the tougher stuff is, but actually I don't think that that's today. What's really happening is that this is meant to, hopefully around the edges reduce the benefits bill, but in a positive way, bringing people back into work. And then in the spring comes the really difficult bit, because that's when the government will outline where they are cutting the benefits bill. They're quite explicit in the bottom of the press release that we got on this, that they want to reduce the health and disability benefits bill. And of course, they've already inherited cuts in this area. Jeremy Hunt announced them before the last election. Rachel Reeves has matched them, but we don't know yet where the money is coming from. And we're not going to know until the spring, but we can see the direction of travel, because they've said that they will consult extensively with disabled people in the spring on the impact of the cuts. So reading between the lines, the direction of travel is cuts to disability benefits, which will be quite tough, but they're just kicking the can down the road again on this. And even when it's announced in spring, it will be subject to consultation. They'll say that they're in listening mode. So it could be really quite a long time before the government just fronts it up and says, here's what we're doing, here's where the cuts are falling.
Yeah, it's conveniently lots of headlines in the Daily Telegraph, alluding to, as I say, get on your bike. But as you say, the policy might not actually come into action for a long time. It's funny the way you say they're having to reframe the carrot and the stick. I remember when Jonathan Ashworth was Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, we talked to him about how there's such a difference in the feel between a recruitment centre and a job centre. The job centre really feels like the place where you go and pick up your benefits, not where you go and find a job. And that was at a time when it was Mel Stride who was dealing with the economic inactivity problem, and he was in the Tory government. But from what we know at the moment, Ailbhe, what's the difference between the Labour approach and the Conservative approach to this problem then?
I think that if a Labour person were speaking really honestly to you, they would say that they're trying to do the same cuts better.
They're just picking up where the Tories left off.
But they basically haven't committed to any specific pensions yet. And so I think that by front-loading this with sort of more positive measures, so sort of asking employers, how can we actually help disabled people to stay in the workplace, or people struggling with long-term sickness, how can we be a bit more accommodating, what needs to change? And also, a big portion of this is actually just changes to the health service. If you clear that backlog, then the hope is that you actually do reduce some of that long-term sickness. But actually, fundamentally, your question is completely correct. They're going to make the same cuts probably, and they just don't know how yet.
Well, except the framing, the aims, and the road that you travel along are also important, aren't they? In terms of the kind of philosophical difference between Labour and Tory. But having said that, how does Labour square this with the Workers' Rights Bill? And also, how do they square this when business does seem to have fallen kind of out of love, if they ever were in love with the Labour Party, certainly at the CPI conference yesterday. And they're being asked to do a lot, as you say, to keep people, for example, also who are unwell in various ways, in work for longer, to try to sort of keep people attached to their job.
This is very unfortunate timing for the government, because you have this massive contradiction between announcing your plans to get to an 80% employment rate at the same time as businesses are warning that they're going to have to cut jobs because of all the measures in the budget.
Or hold back hiring.
Yeah, exactly. So actually we might see the employment rate decrease potentially. But that depends on time horizons and immigration and so many things. But definitely there's a bit of a tension there, and that sort of, and they coincided in our story as well.
But then there's also the issue of, if you also at the same time want to clamp down on migration and or at least the number of people coming in to the UK, you also have to do more with the labour supply that you've got at the moment.
I don't know how it compares with the Conservatives, but definitely Labour have put a lot of thought into the skills agenda, and it's sort of a big part of one of their 5 missions, sort of increasing opportunity. So the idea, I think, actually, when you look at the plans on this, is actually it is quite joined up with what the Health Department is doing, what the Education Department is doing, what the Home Office is doing in terms of like youth hubs, skills, etc. And also devolution. Mayors are going to have a big role in this. Like from speaking to lots of local government officials, it sounds as though they hear from a local manufacturer that they don't have the skills that they need. They don't have young people with the skills they need to come and do the jobs that they need to do. And then the local university or the local college isn't really training people, and they just need a sort of a mayor or someone in the middle to facilitate that and say, okay, if we have a course in this on the one hand, then we will have jobs here on the other. And so I think that the skills agenda and encouraging people back into work that way is going to be a big part of this.
Yeah, and also the way that we measure, this goal of getting to 80% employment rate. Actually, when you look at how the OECD does it and these other sort of supranational kind of organisations that look at economics, they do slice it by age group. So they don't just think about getting 80% employment for everybody. They dice it up into different age groups and whether you can get to that target within the age group. So that's sort of also quite important.
Can I ask you a big picture view, just to take the temperature? There's been this petition that I'm sure listeners will have seen on the Parliament website calling for another election. It's been signed by 2.3 million people. Caroline mentioned how there's this sense of impatience at the CBI that we got yesterday, which is a complete contrast from when Keir Starmer arrived in opposition and he was like the rock star of the conference. How seriously should we take all this, or do you think it's just newspapers lapping up the drama about a government that's been in office for a few months now?
I mean, I don't think that things are going well.
But is it a crisis, is what I'm asking you?
Well, I mean, they have a long time, and I mean, the blessing is that they don't have to call an election for a long time, so that petition doesn't really matter. And obviously, we take that number with a massive pinch of salt because people from all around the world can sign that as long as they can find a British postcode. Yeah. But I think that there is a sense of, I think, panic and looking towards Christmas. I think the government is trying to think of doing a bit of a reset, specifying targets within its 5 missions and kind of trying to stay on message.
Okay, yeah, the difficulty in office a few months, but they've got to get on with it. Do they have time to deliver on that decade of national renewal, which is what they have promised? Ailbhe, thank you so much for your time. That is Bloomberg's Associate Editor covering UK politics, Ailbhe Rea. Thank you.
That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineer was Sean Gwestamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.